Lawmakers across the country are reacting to the capture of former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife. Arkansas Senator and Senate Intelligence Committee Chair Tom Cotton is among them. Cotton says drugs smuggled into the U.S. have killed hundreds of Arkansans and thousands of other Americans. He expects U.S. involvement in Venezuela to last for months.
Venezuela was once a thriving free market democratic country, closely allied with the United States. But for 27 years now, under Nicolas Maduro and before him, Hugo Chavez, the country has been run by people who are both corrupt and incompetent. So it's a badly scarred country that's going to take some time to nurse back to health.
Senator Cotton confirmed he was not briefed on the operation and believes no one in Congress should have been.
Meanwhile, Missouri Senator Josh Hawley gave his thoughts on the future of Venezuela.
I would just say that I'm not in favor of running foreign countries. Today, Secretary Rubio briefed senators and said that we are not going to do that with regard to Venezuela. I hope he's right about that.
Hawley went on to say that running other countries or exerting power over other countries in terms of running their governments is something that we don't want to do.